Today I'm going to walk you through how to create simple dungeons for your D&D campaign. These are designs particularly for Theater of the Mind and grid maps. And today I'm going to show you two simple ways on how to do that. So when it comes to thinking about these two different methods, a lot of DMs or dungeon masters use Theater of the Mind and grid maps to really help engage their players. Each method has its own unique ways of making sure that members can understand how they are moving through a space, interacting with the story, engaging enemies. And I particularly like to use a mix of the methods, which perhaps I'll walk through in a future video. But for this video, I really wanted to focus on how you can create ones if your games are more on a VTT like Roll20 or Owlbear or Fantasy Grounds, etc. On how you can use maps, quick dungeons to kind of like design those maps, and if you're using more Theater of the Mind, how you can create very quick, easy dungeons that will engage your players. So stick around and welcome to Dungeon Debuff. So today we're going to focus on the types of gameplay, planning out your dungeon layout, and populating your dungeon. So thinking about Theater of the Mind is more focused on imagination. It's focused on really describing the world to your players, allowing them to get in the headspace of their characters, what they see, what they smell, what are some things that they hear around them. And it's a good way on really helping them guide through the story, but also allowing them to respond and add some flavor of their own to the world that you created. In terms of dungeons, it really helps build suspense, and I found that for exploration, it really helps engage the players more by helping them explore and give them a few details so that they can think about on how their character would interact. That's really led to dungeons feeling more creepy, feeling darker, really allowing my players. I've seen them be more flexible on how to use their equipment and how to use their abilities. And that goes to my next point on Theater of the Mind really helps you be flexible and creative, not just as a DM, but also as a player, on how it really allows you to respond to the ways that your players are engaging with your world. It allows you to improv things, it allows you to respond to the types of encounters that you may have planned, but you're seeing that they're going a different direction. And then also for role playing, it because it's mostly a game that's focused in your imagination, it allows you to really think about how your character feels. And that prompt becomes a little bit easier as a DM as you're guiding them through the dungeon, having them focus on what their characters are feeling, but also how they interact with each other. There have been many times where a lot of the dungeon is very player driven and the conversation is player driven. And that allows me as a DM to sit back and listen and change things as they're exploring, that could be also more fun for the players. So it allows you to, as a DM, to really be more reactive, but also in that way that you're reactive, you make it more engaging because you're listening to your players and you're changing things as you're playing together. This is an example of a dungeon that I ran with my players. I literally had this behind my computer on a corkboard behind my screen, and I put it up with thumbtacks. And I made this flowchart very simply by just starting with a starting point and then branching out. Here I have like five main branches. Off to the side, I have my notes for what each of the numbers represent. What is the setting like when they start? How do they feel? What does the space look like? For this particular adventure, this was the Hag's Den, and the players here were responsible or tasked with finding a noble. A noble has been kidnapped. The players had been searching the nearby wilderness on the last sightings of the noble, and it led them the footprints that I believe that the druid found led them to this cave. Upon entering the cave, I start kind of walking through, painting a picture that they're starting to find clues of the people that were here before. It turns out that they weren't the only party that was sent after, but there was a his guards were sent prior to them arriving here, but they failed. So now they're finding their bodies. They're finding equipment left behind. They're finding markings on the wall, and kind of just like peppering some of that throughout the dungeon so that they can understand where they are. I started off with a trap in one room, very small, light trap, just kind of being an annoyance. This was a basic tripwire with a acid type. The tripwire would be broken if they trigger it, and it would drop some acid vials on them. And you find at the end of this room there is a guard, the noble's guard, that's wounded here. It looks like he's trying to barricade himself or try to protect himself from whatever's in here. They find the bloody footprints, they find items here. But even in the way that they enter this room, they had to squeeze through a narrow passage. So I had checks for that. And as I progress through the different branches, there's one space that they'll find loot. There's another space where they'll find another trap. For the traps, I try to make it more progressively harder as they get towards the end, and you'll see that in a bit and how I did that. But for the most part, really giving them a choice. The cape takes you in this direction. You're following a narrow passage. The floor is muddy and slick, and they're going down an incline. I'm going to need you to roll a athletics check to try to navigate the rocks here in this passage. As you come towards the end of the corridor, you find this path splits in two, one towards the left, one towards the right. Which path do you take? And for that part, it was really exciting because it then branched off to different paths. During my game, it was very exciting because I had my players. Well, I didn't have my players; they just naturally did it. They started to take notes and make the path. So as they're talking to each other, as they're making comments, whatever their comments are matching up with what I've already drawn on my end. So it was really nice to kind of see them like track their path through the dungeon, but also make their own notes. So that was exciting. Moving on to grid-based maps. Grid-based maps are very much like a blueprint. They show a nice representation of where they are in this space. What are some of the things you want to represent in the story? You can do that more clearly. Sometimes you can label things on your map and you can make it really immersive on things that you can interact with during combats or during encounters. So I find it also is just sometimes there's a um, especially if you're leaning more towards a VTT, or if you like to mix the two methods and you like to use grid maps, that leads to a lot of strategic combat, especially with some of the abilities and spells and weapons that you have. If you have players that really like to focus more on kind of their positioning, where the enemies are, how can you use the spell to line up and get multiple targets, that's a great way to engage them. And to that end, exploration feels more immersive. I'll share in a bit like an example of how you can use that same map that I showed in a grid setting. Still using your imagination, still using some elements of theater of the mind, but depending on how detailed you make your map, whether you hand draw it or if you're using a platform, you can make it as immersive as you like. So there's no limits to how you can do that, but um, it allows people a visual aid as they're walking through your story. And then also complex encounters. You can put terrain, you can add walls and barriers and doors and different creatures, natural barriers like water or lava or even allies. When creating dungeons in that way, it's helpful to think about the purpose, but also the space. So the end of the dungeon had a boss fight with the hag. The hag was keeping the noble to herself, and unbeknownst to the player, the nobles made a deal, and reneged on that deal. So the hag was keeping the noble there as punishment. In this dungeon, it was very small. The hag hung out around the her giant cauldron, where there was, it was lit. It was there was some kind of potion or substance brewing in there that led to the light being focused in that corner. And this encounter was very focused on light and on the shadows. So using the hag's ability to turn invisible, it was a good way for the party to not just try to rescue the noble, but also have this interesting boss battle where they're trying to find the invisible hag in the darkness, but also the hag herself has some shadows that's attacking the players, and they can't find their enemies without using light. So some of the part that was not really focus in magic, they had to find creative ways. So they started throwing torches around the room. They started lighting red, some of their like dancing lights, like the druid, and casting an area so that they can illuminate some of the corners of the dungeon. Some of them tried sticking a light on the shadow themselves so that they can find it easy to destroy it. And some of that was very led to being able to actually see the encounter, see the map, which made it really fun. And this is an example of the two side by side. I used Dungeon Scrawl to create this, and I'll have that in the description in the video. Very simple. You can use other platforms like Incarnate to kind of like create a more detailed version of this. But usually the things I like to do on my end is like I'll have my map and I'll have like my notes kind of detailing very similar to some of these things. But if I'm using a VTT, I can move the players through the space through the starting point and then have some fog of war, some shadows kind of covering up some of the parts. Then you can label monsters and stuff in here. Or if using a platform like I know some VTTs like Albert Rodeo or Roll20 allows you to kind of put like sticky notes on the side, so you can make those invisible and have the notes there. There's a simple template you can use when creating a dungeon. Thinking about your like I mentioned the quest, what monsters you want to use, traps, loot, and what your reward is. And as an example, the quest I ran for my players was to rescue a kidnapped noble. They had to deal with three shadows and a hag. This was for, I believe, a level 3 party, but it worked out. It ended up being a challenging encounter, but it didn't totally kill the NPCs. Use at your own discretion. I like to make my encounters a little bit harder, but give the players plenty of ways to address that. So it's challenging for them, but also sometimes things happen and the players fail. But it makes it much more rewarding if they, you know, complete that encounter. On my end, a lot of players had very powerful abilities through some of their homebrew classes that we were using, so I ended up tweaking it a bit. But with shadows, I use them with caution. And then some of the traps that I had a acid spray, I had a collapsing ceiling, I had a slippery slope. There was a long passage on that chart on that map of the players going down an incline, and they had to balance. And at the end of the incline was pit, a pit they couldn't see the bottom of. So it was one of the harder challenges that would have led to very serious injury to the players or even allowing them to lose a character and have to create a new one. But I wanted to create some sense of urgency, some sense of danger for their players. So they had opportunities throughout, and they were able to solve that together by working together. In our case, the players used ropes and they tied it to each other, anchoring themselves as they navigate down the slippery path to the next section of tunnels that they had to navigate, or the next section of tunnels that they had to move through. And then the loot, I had a book of lore. I had a Hag's book, kind of like her notes, her account of what was happening. So knowing that most likely the players are going to end up fighting the hag. If they defeat her, they'll learn her side of the story and allow them kind of like find a new quest in that. And then I had jewels, things like rubies and sapphires, emeralds, stuff that she collected from people trying to stop her before. It was all kind of thrown in this sack in their corner, in this chest that she had. And the reward was that when they saved the noble was going to give them a favor. And this favor in my game was a introduction to a area that they previously didn't have access to, but allow them to, with the noble's blessing and its connections, they were able to now go and access that area. Thank you so much for watching. If you find this helpful, give it a like and subscribe for more tips. And let me know in the comments how you simplify your dungeons. I'd love to hear your ideas. And until next time, happy gaming, and I'll see you in the next video.